Today we are going to be reading George Crum and the Saratoga Chip, written by Gayla Taylor and illustrated by Frank Morrison. George stood before the students in his one-room schoolhouse. His palms were sweaty and his knees were weak. All the first graders could count to 100 except George. His sister Kate sat across the room with the older students. Kate helped George practice his numbers at home every night and was always encouraging him. He looked at Kate, took a deep breath, and started to count. George counted up to 68, then got confused and couldn't remember which number came next. The other children laughed, and George felt his skin begin to prickle. It was difficult for George and Kate growing up in the 1830s. They were part Native American and part African American, at a time when people of color in the United States were often treated as inferior to white people. George had a feisty streak, and he would get frustrated when the other children laughed at him or acted as if they were better than he was. He wanted them to know that he was just as good as they were. When George was with Kate, his feistiness turned playful and mischievous. He joked with his sister. He teased her. He taught Kate to climb a tree and shoot a bow and arrow better than any boy in the whole county. So I'm going to pause here and ask a question. Why did George get frustrated with his fellow classmates? I'll say it again. Why did George get frustrated with his fellow classmates? Feel free to answer the question if you're with someone and respond to the person next to you, or you can just answer it in your head. George loved the outdoors. He spent hours fishing and exploring the nearby Adirondack Mountains. He watched the wild turkeys strut around with their hens, fascinated by their iridescent colors. He listened carefully and practiced imitating their calls. This amused George for hours. After he finished his schooling, George began fishing and hunting full time. He made a living by selling fresh fish and wild game to nearby restaurants. One day, George met a Frenchman hunting in the mountains. The Frenchman was an excellent cook, and he taught George how to prepare his fresh fish and game over the open flames of an outdoor fire. George quickly discovered he had a passion for cooking. He experimented with different spices and cooking techniques, a pinch of salt here, some extra heat there, until each recipe was just right. Soon George had perfected many delicious meals: freshly roasted game birds, poached fish, grilled venison, and more. George wanted to show all of Saratoga Springs what a good cook he was. He decided the best way to do this was to become a chef in a restaurant. It wasn't easy for George to get a job as a chef in those days. Most restaurant owners wouldn't hire a man of color to be anything but a waiter. George didn't let that stop him. Sure enough, George's excellent cooking skills shone through. He landed a job at Moon's Lake House, one of the best restaurants in Saratoga Springs. George's heart swelled when he thought about all the people who would now enjoy his meals. I'm going to pause and ask another question. How do you think George felt while applying for jobs, knowing that most restaurant owners wouldn't hire a man of color to be anything but a waiter? How do you think that George felt while applying for jobs? George quickly became famous for his wild game and fish dishes. Prominent people, including Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America, traveled great distances to eat at Moon's Lake House. George's most sought-after dish was his canvasback duck. It was so tender and juicy that no other chef in the area could match its taste. George enjoyed creating new recipes at Moon's Lake House, but he soon realized he had little patience for the fussy customers. They demanded immediate attention to their needs and were quick to complain. They acted as if they were better than the people serving them, something George did not like in the least. Luckily, Kate worked as a waitress at the restaurant. She tried her best to keep George in good spirits and his feistiness from getting the better of him. One evening, a customer complained to Kate that his meal was not hot enough. Kate apologized, picking up the man's plate and headed swiftly towards the kitchen. George knew the meal he had sent out had been perfectly prepared, but he also knew he had to please the restaurant's customers, so he carefully scraped the tender quail and vegetables into a black iron skillet over hot flames. After a few minutes, George tested the temperature of the food and decided it was just right. With great care, he scooped everything onto a fresh plate and placed it on a silver platter. George wiped the sweat from his brow, straightened his starched white chef's apron, and stepped out into the dining room. Proud of his efforts, George placed the hot meal in front of the customer. The man took a small bite, then announced that the food was still not hot enough. George's skin prickled. He tried to hide his annoyance and gave the man a weak smile. Without a word, George took the plate and quickly turned. All of a sudden, he lost his balance and tripped. A ripple of laughter passed through the dining room when George hit the floor. His cheeks grew hot and flushed. As George brushed himself off, he heard a woman whisper loudly about the poor quality of the staff. George felt just like he was back in first grade, trying to count to 100. He headed to the safety of the kitchen, hoping the night would soon be over. George continued to have good days and bad days with the customers at Moon's Lake House. He still loved cooking, but his patience for pleasing difficult customers was growing thin. Then one hot summer day in August 1853, something happened that changed George's life forever. It was lunchtime, and Moon's Lake House was packed. A woman ordered French fried potatoes, a relatively new and fashionable item at the time. Some chefs would have shied away from making something new when the restaurant was so busy, but George was sure his friend, the French woodsman, had taught him how to make perfect French fries. So George cooked up a piping hot batch and sent them out to the customer. The woman looked at the plate of French fries and before even taking a bite complained to the waiter that the potatoes were cut too thick. The waiter knew not to argue with the customer, so he graciously took the French fries back to the kitchen. George was shocked to see the potatoes returned. He had just about had enough of fussy customers. George grabbed a potato and started slicing. Kate saw a spark of feistiness in her brother's eyes that she hadn't seen in quite a while. George was very, very careful to cut the potatoes very, very thin. They were so thin that when he held a slice up to the light, he could see straight through it. Then he put the slices into a pot full of hot oil. He purposely cooked the potatoes longer and at a higher temperature than was needed for perfect French fries. So what do you think he's making? When the potatoes were crisp and brown, George removed them from the oil and piled them onto a plate. He decided to serve his special new creation to the customer himself. Kate and other members of the staff peered anxiously through the kitchen doors. Their eyes were glued to the woman. No one wanted to miss her reaction. George presented the plate of fried potatoes and waited for the woman's complaints. She took a small bite, then another, and another. Finally, she declared them the most delicious potato delicacy she had ever tasted. George was so stunned he didn't know what to say. He mumbled his thanks and returned to the kitchen in a daze. From that day on, everybody who came to Moon's Lake House wanted the new potato creation. Some people were calling them Saratoga chips in honor of Saratoga Springs, where the restaurant was located. George continued cooking at Moon's Lake House for several years, but then he got to thinking it was time to leave. He still didn't like cooking for people who looked down on other folks and treated them badly. George started dreaming of his own restaurant, a comfortable place where anyone could enjoy a good meal and everyone would be treated equally. George was confident that with his cooking skills and the popularity of his Saratoga chips, he could make his own way in the restaurant business. After leaving Moon's Lake House, George bought some land and built a restaurant that he named Crum's Place. On the surrounding farmland, he raised chickens, cows, and pigs, and grew vegetables and fruit. All the food served in the restaurant came fresh from the farm, including the potatoes for George's famous chips. George was proud of his restaurant. It was nestled among tall shade trees and had an inviting front porch facing a lake. It was a comfortable place where diners could enjoy good food, fun, and laughter. So I'm going to pause here and ask another question. Why do you think George was so proud of his restaurant? Why do you think George was so proud of his restaurant? There were always long lines at Crum's Place, and customers had to wait their turns for seats in the dining room. So George devised a rule that made him very happy indeed. Rich or poor, light-skinned or dark, young or old, female or male, everybody had to wait just the same because everyone was equal at Crum's Place. And if any customers happened to fuss about waiting their turn, good old George would get a feisty look in his eyes and say, "If you can't wait, get your grub at Moon's." The end.